Good morning, everybody. How we doing today? We getting enough sleep? That light's really bright. Thank you for, is it day 3? We're past hump day, that's all I know. At Americana Fest, welcome to our 25th anniversary birthday party, if you will. It is my great honor to be standing on this stage. You know, there's so many people in this community who are so passionate about music and they know so much about music, but the people that are to my right know more than all of us. So, like, if they say this is the way it is, I'm gonna go with that and we can not fight. There's too much, dare I get political, too much division in this world today. We have authorities, so we'll just go from there. I also want to start by paying tribute to the gentleman to my right who will be conducting this conversation, although in his words, he'll just be listening. But Buddy Miller may be the only one who has been to every Americana Fest, every award show in the history of this organization. We ride on the backs of Buddy. Some call him Captain Americana. I'm honored to call him my friend. He is our musical director. I'll leave it to him to introduce the illustrious Americana UK Lifetime Achievement honoree, Joe Boyd. Buddy, it's all yours. Thank you for coming, Joe.
I think I've been more nervous about this than any gig I've ever played. So starting there, I know I'm going to screw it up. You are a legend. Everybody here is here for Joe Boyd.
I doubt that, but
the history, which we will talk about, just the things you did before your previous book, White Bicycles. There's so much. Everything you've done is great. We'll talk about the new book, though. That's what we're mainly talking about today, and the roots of rhythm remain. Great book. There's a copy of it floating around here someplace.
Wait for it.
This book is a masterpiece. And you said you spent yesterday
a lot of years. Let's not get too specific, but since I finished White Bicycles, this is kind of what I've been doing.
And that was when did you finish White Bicycles?
2006.
Yeah.
So.
And you know what?
Do the math. Don't do the math. Yeah.
You said you spent a lot of yesterday at Middle Tennessee.
I did.
And I think you're going to be spending as much time as you want to in schools. I think this is a book that will be taught. And it's such a valuable resource and treasure. And every page holds a revelation and a surprise. And it's just, you can enjoy music without knowing it. But I think, and I don't want to talk too much in here, but I want to find this quote in the foreword. I'd want to just read this one thing that you wrote.
Yeah.
That says, "It may be rash to suggest that reading about music can be as enjoyable as listening to it, but my aspiration for this book is that it will open readers' minds and ears as mine have been to a wider, richer musical world." And I'll tell you, it did that for me in such a huge way. The stories on every page are incredible.
Well, I mean, one of the things that inspired me to start this Sisyphean task, which eventually, quixotic task, maybe that's better, was I have this hallway in my flat, in our flat in London, with a lot of books on both sides. And in the middle of each side is music books, and there's hundreds of them, biographies, analyses, histories, but they're so thorough on Anglo-American music. You know, I've got biographies of Miles Davis and Jarvis Cocker and Duke Ellington and Willie Nelson, and and there's so much great writing, Peter Guralnick and Nick Tosches and all these heroic figures, but that kind of writing was hard to find about music from elsewhere, about music from Cuba, from Jamaica, from Africa, from Eastern Europe, or tango from Argentina. And I don't know, I just thought, okay, let me try and set that balance, rebalance that. Let me try and write something cool and readable that opens up this music that most people know. You heard the Bulgarian choir, you've heard Yusundur, you've heard Latin music, you've heard some tango, and all these great forms, but very few people know the stories behind it, the personalities, which are just as riveting as Elvis walking into Sun Records asking how much it would cost to cut a demo for his mother's birthday. There's stories like that everywhere.
And the stories, I wish I was looking for, because I have one, a globe. I wanted to bring a globe to spin around, because you have stories of songs and music and how it travels around the world and transforms and evolves or devolves. Mm-hmm. And I want to get talking about that book, but we can't start with that. We need to talk about some of your things you've done, because it's just incredible. In your previous book, White Bicycles, and I told Emmylou Harris that I was going to be speaking with you, and for instance, she said, well, I'm going to wait on that just one second, because even before that, your career before you started producing, Newport, 65, Bob Dylan, you were carrying the message, doing the sound and telling them that you could tell the story. Yeah.
Well, I was, right out of college, my first job was tour managing Muddy Waters, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Blind Gary Davis, who I gather was inducted into the Hall of Fame here just the other night. And, it was an incredible first job out of college. I was very lucky. And George Wein, I was working for George Wein, the promoter, and he liked the job I did with tour managing jazz musicians and things like that. And he said he never liked paying for airfares. He was a bit parsimonious, George. But he said, if you happen to be back in America and around the East Coast next summer, come on up to Newport and you can be the production manager. And so I was the production manager on the Newport Jazz Festival 1965 and the Newport Folk Festival 1965. And, it was a very intense, extraordinary time, because in that moment, everybody was astounded that for the first time there was like a 6-minute long single getting played on Top 40 radio by Bob Dylan, called Like a Rolling Stone. And also on Top 40 radio was Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. And people just couldn't stop talking about, will he dare? Would he bring an electric guitar to Newport, to the folk festival? No, he wouldn't do that, would he? And this was the talk the whole weeks leading up to the folk festival. So you knew that this, whatever happened, was momentous. And so as it happened, we sound-checked him with the Butterfield Band, and we made sure, I went out and bought a pink Day-Glo magic marker, because Paul Rothschild was actually doing the sound. I was up on stage. He was at the sound controls. And he had a piece of paper on a clipboard for every artist. We sound-checked everybody. And we wanted to make sure the sound was really good. But for Dylan, we didn't have a piece of paper. We had those pink glow-in-the-dark marks on the stage for every amp, on the amp for the setting. And so the minute he hit the first stroke of Maggie's Farm, it was loud. And I later came to slightly, I wouldn't say regret. You know, I was youthful. I was like, yeah, old guard, get a step back. This is what's happening. And later, I sort of saw Pete Seeger's point that this was a beautiful acoustic thing, this festival. And Bob Dylan and his electric guitar brought the music business, a career move, a top 40 move, into this hallowed ground. And I totally understand Pete Seeger's heartbreak about that.
You mentioned the Butterfield Band. Were you not responsible for bringing Mike Bloomfield to the Butterfield Band?
Yeah, I guess I was. I mean, I used to, my brother and I and Jeff Moldor, the blues singer you may know, when we were teenagers in Princeton, not realizing that the younger Buddy lived down the street from us, but we used to get together every weekend and listen to blues records and play, you know, all this stuff. And we would sometimes go on pilgrimages to Chicago, and where we would visit the Jazz Record Mart on South Wabash. And there's a guy called Bob Kester who ran that shop. And we would thumb through the LPs, and one day there was a guy thumbing through the LPs who was about our age, and we started talking to him, and he actually turned out to be a guitar player. And so he got out his guitar and started showing off some very cool moves on the guitar, and that was Mike Bloomfield. And then when I got ready to take my first trip to London with the Blues and Gospel Tour, I went to Chicago and I went to visit Muddy to introduce myself. I'm going to be your tour manager in Europe. Here I am. I was sat down in Pepper's Lounge, and this white guy walked in with electric guitar, and Muddy said, "Oh, hi, Mike, and you want to sit in?" And so Mike Bloomfield sat in with Muddy. And so then a year later, I'm out in Chicago. I heard about Butterfield, and I told Paul Rothchild about Butterfield. And he and I both went to Chicago, and he thought they were great, and he talked to Butterfield about signing him up. And I said, I think this is a great band, but you know, if you really want to kick the door down, you need a guitar hero. And Elvin Bishop was a great guitar player, but he wasn't really a guitar hero in that Clapton sense of the word. I said to Butterfield, I said, "Do you know Mike Bloomfield?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I know Mike. He's playing tomorrow night up in Evanston." And so the three of us went up the next night to Evanston, and Butterfield sat in with Bloomfield's band, and you could just see this magic thing happen on stage. And then Paul Rothchild went backstage to Bloomfield and said, "I'll make you a star. Join the Butterfield band and come to New York, and let's make a record."
I got to see that band at the McCarter Theater in Princeton, yeah, with Elvin and Mike. I love a moment that you decided to be a producer at a house concert that you put on years before this.
No, my moment. I mean,
or was it a different? Okay.
It was a nice moment. I mean, I thought in my mind, in my fevered imagination, teenage imagination, I thought I was a pretty good baseball player, and I wasn't. And so I found myself sitting on the bench and occasionally getting to pinch hit late in the game and grounding to shortstop. And and before the big dance weekend game, I was catching fly balls in the outfield for the starting nine. And I had read a book by Sam Charters called The Country Blues, which is about the first book that I had ever been published about all these great old singers from the South. And in the middle of this book, I seized on this one name, Ralph Peer. Wow, that would have been a time to be alive, to be a Ralph Peer and go through the South and find Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family and Memphis Jug Band. And it's too bad that that's all over, that you can't really do that anymore. And then I was out there in the field catching fly balls, and somebody opened a window nearby in the dormitory, and out the window came Fats Domino walking to New Orleans. And I went, wait a minute, Fats Domino's from New Orleans, he plays the piano. That's kind of like what Jelly Roll Morton used to do, and you know, it sort of seems like maybe that era isn't over. Maybe music didn't end, you know, in 1950. Maybe I could still be Ralph Peer, you know. And so I decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to be a record producer.
And what a record producer. The list. Let's talk about that before we get to the new book. This is being recorded. I'm going to cut it up, and it's going to be a radio show on Sirius XM. So I want to talk briefly about a bunch of artists. We're not going to play the music. We'll do that on the radio. But there's so many artists. Was the first thing you produced that What's Shakin', those tracks on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, talk about luck. After the Newport experience, you know, I knew Paul Rothchild for years from the Boston folk scene. And Paul sadly died way too young, but before he died, he produced the great Doors records and the great Janis Joplin records. And he was just a wonderful producer from whom I learned so much. And he, as a reward for the Mike Bloomfield Butterfield thing, he persuaded Jack Holtzman at Elektra to let me go back to London, where I had been with the blues tour and with a couple of other things, and open the Elektra Records office there. Sort of it was really just a desk and a telephone in our distributor's warehouse. And just before I was leaving, Paul told me that he was putting together an electric blues compilation, like the Blues Project that had come before, which was an acoustic record of different singers doing blues. This was different bands, and he already had 4 tracks of the Love and Spoonful that he'd recorded before they signed with Kama Sutra, and he had some tracks by Al Cooper, some tracks by Tom Rush, and Butterfield, and some tracks by Butterfield from an album that they'd scrapped and decided to re-record a whole first album. And I said, don't finish that record. Wait, save me 3 tracks. I'll find a blues band in London, and we'll have an English, that'll bring the English branch of Elektra into the bosom of the label, you know, by having these tracks from England. And of course, I got to London and started looking around for unsigned blues bands, and there weren't any. You know, everybody were signing every band that could even carry a tune, you know, was getting signed up by a label in London in those days. It was a feeding frenzy, and I was kind of embarrassed, like I'd made this big claim that I was going to make these 3 tracks, and I wasn't. And just then the door opened, and in walks Paul Jones, who was the lead singer of Manfred Mann. And he had a gospel record by a Guyanan singer called Ram John Holder that he thought Elektra should release. And I wasn't too interested in Ram John Holder, but we talked, and I mentioned this project to him. And Paul said, oh man, everybody I know would love to be on a record with Paul Butterfield and Love and Spoonful. You know, who do you want? And we got out an envelope, back of an envelope. Eric Clapton, guitar, Steve Winwood, vocal, Ginger Baker, drums, Jack Bruce, bass. You know, this was before Cream. And Paul said, yeah, that's no problem. I'll give them all a call. I'll get back to you. And I thought, I don't think so. I mean, I think this, I'll never hear from him again. And 2 days later, he called me up. He said, yeah, everybody's set except for Ginger. He's way on tour somewhere. But we're going to get Pete York from the Spencer Davis group. And so my first ever session as a producer was with Eric Clapton and Steve Winwood. And we cut 3 tracks.
Yeah. Well, let's touch for the radio show, and we'll go quickly because we need to get to the book. But you can't, there's so much. And we'll start with, when Emmylou heard we were going to be speaking, she said you must talk about the McGarrigle sisters, Kate and Anna.
Well, again, you know, there's, I think music, and in this book, actually, there's an awful lot of happenstance, accident, chance encounters, misunderstandings, people trying to play one thing and inventing something else by accident. And in a way, my coming across Kate McGarrigle and her sister Anna fell a little bit into that category. I had known Maria Muldaur for years and years, and I was working for the film company, Warner Brothers Films, and then I kind of got tired of that job. It mostly involved directors calling me up and saying, "Get me John Williams." And okay, yeah, all right. And so I produced a film about Jimi Hendrix, and that was my exit strategy. That made me a producer instead of an executive. And
May I just interrupt for 1 second, because I didn't want you to miss this. You produced the music for Deliverance, Dueling Banjos. That's one of the tracks.
That was, before I left this job, I got to work on Deliverance and recording Eric Weisberg and Dueling Banjos, and which was supposed to be Bill Keith. Actually, this is a good story for Nashville. When John Boorman said he wanted this banjo tune played straight, backwards, slow, minor, major, upside down, inside out, that was his idea for the score of Deliverance. And I said, well, there's one guy, only one guy, Bill Keith. It's got to be Bill Keith. And so I tracked down Bill, and he was on tour in Ireland. And I got a hold of him backstage at a concert in Galway, and on the phone, and I said, "You got to come back. We got to do this session down in Georgia for this film." And he said, "How much money's in it?" And I said, $2,000. And he said, "You know, Joe, I just met this girl over here, and I think I'm going to stay here for a few weeks. Get Weisberg to do it." And so I said, "Come on, Bill, please, no, get Weisberg." And so,
Royalties paid on that?
Well, exactly. Nobody knew. I mean, it was just a $2,000 film score job. And so Weisberg did it, and of course, the rest of the story. And then I got to work with Stanley Kubrick on Clockwork Orange, and with electronic Beethoven and the real Beethoven and all that stuff. And that wasn't really working with Stanley. That was working for Stanley. He'd call you up and say, "This is what I want," and you, "Yes, sir."
Well, edit back to the McGarrigles.
Right. The McGarrigle, yes, of course. So then I was sort of out of work, and I thought I had this fantasy that I was now a film producer, and then Maria was starting her record with working with Lenny Waronker as a producer, and every night I would get 2 telephone calls, just like clockwork. One from Lenny, "Maria's so difficult. I mean, what does she want? She's just very picky about songs, and I don't know, And then I put the phone down, the phone would ring. It was Maria. "Joe, Lenny, he's so awkward, And finally we had this lunch, and they turned to me and they said, "Listen, Joe, come on, join the team, be the co-producer, help us out." And so, we cut Midnight at the Oasis, but one of the songs we cut was a song called Work Song. And I never heard the demo that Maria learned it from, but she said she got it from this girl who was a singer-songwriter in New York. And then we had this hit with Midnight at the Oasis, so of course there had to be a second album. And on the second album, we were meeting with Maria and going through all those songs, possible songs, and she said, well, I said, what about that girl that wrote Work Song? Doesn't she have any more songs? And she said, that's a good idea, I'll call her up. So the next time we met, she had a cassette that had been sent to her from New York, and we listened, and there was a song in there called Cool River. And it had these amazing harmonies where the voices sounded so similar. I assumed that they'd been sort of double-tracked, like overdubbed, like the same voice twice. And so we decided to record it, and I said, let's get, those harmonies are so great. Let's get Kate McGarrell to come out and do those harmonies. And she said, okay, I'll call her. And then Kate said, I got a new baby. I can only come if my sister comes, because I need somebody to look after the baby when I'm in the studio. That was my understanding of the message that was relayed through a secretary. And so I said, okay. It was Warner Brothers, mid-'70s. You know, there was money just oozing out of every drawer at Warner Brothers. So sure, fly your sister out. Stay at the Chateau Marmont, no problem. And then they both came to the studio, and there was a little baby, little Rufus in the basket, and when they just stood by the piano, and two of the sisters started singing those harmonies, and I said, "Oh, you mean that's not an overdub? That's not Kate twice. That's Kate and Anna." And they said, "Oh yeah, that's Kate and Anna," and they just stood there and they opened their mouths, and I went, those harmonies just were unbelievable. And so the next day I went charging into Mo Austin's office and said, we got to do a deal for a record by these girls. And that's how we met.
And you seem to work with only magical, unique, singular voiced artists.
Those are the ones you know about.
Yeah, it seems. Well, you work with a lot of them, and if you could talk briefly about
the ones that weren't magical.
Yeah, no. Okay. In the next show.
Okay.
Fairport and Sandy Denny, Fairport Convention, and.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was in a way, it all loops back to Mike Bloomfield, because I was running this club called the UFO Club in London. Me and a friend called John Hopkins would rent an Irish dance hall every Friday night and put on shows with Pink Floyd and Soft Machine and Arthur Brown and all these different things. And I was always looking for, and every time we put somebody on, by the time the club got so popular that just being a headliner at UFO tripled your fee. And so the next time we wanted to book them, they were too expensive. So I was constantly looking for new bands, and I put them on as an opener, and then then they could be a headliner maybe next time. And so I heard, somebody told me about this group from London called Fairport Convention, and I went down to, they were playing in a little Chinese restaurant or something in Gerrard Street, and I thought, I don't like the repertoire. It was all these Eric Anderson songs and, kind of Dick Farina B-list songs, and I don't know, too much American singer-songwriter stuff. I shouldn't be saying this in this, but I thought, but still, they're really good musicians, and I thought they were really kind of a cool group. So, okay, you can come open for Pink Floyd. And
who was the house band?
Well, they weren't the house. By that time, they were too big to be the house band, but they were doing me a favor by coming back and playing one more time. And so Fairport came on for their first set, and like the second song, they announced that they're going to do East West, which was the Mike Bloomfield Indian raga.
They recorded with Butterfield.
Yeah, recorded with the Butterfield Band. There was this tour de force by Bloomfield at the height of his powers, and I thought to myself, that's really dumb. Like, wow, how stupid can you be to try and outdo Mike Bloomfield on East West? And then Richard stood up there and outdid Mike Bloomfield on East West. I mean, he just kicked his ass. And I thought, wow, I got to work with this guy. And so we made, 3 albums in that mode of that group, which I tried to nudge them towards their own songwriting away from all the Americans. So, and then came this terrible moment where they had a car crash and the drummer was killed, Martin Lamble. and they thought they'll never play again. They finally decided to try and play again, but with a new repertoire. And the big record that spring, the year of the crash, the big record that year you saw everywhere in London was music from Big Pink. Everybody was obsessed with that record. And I think when they were thinking about how to reinvent themselves, they thought, we can't go back to American repertoire because the band has just blocked that exit. You know, it's like, if you want to do original music rooted in American traditions, we've just shown you how good that can be. Try it. Go on. We dare you. And instead, the Fairport decided, actually, we'll do something that is as British as the band Big Pink is American. And that resulted in Legion Leaf.
And you mentioned the quote from Los Lobos in your book.
Right. That was just years later. An English singer named Ralph McTell, who'd sung in some festival somewhere in America or Europe, I don't know where, but he was on the bill with Los Lobos. And one of the guys from Los Lobos came up to him and said, "You know Fairport Convention, right?" And this was before Richard had moved to LA and become a great friend of Los Lobos, but this was back early in the late 70s or something. And he said, "Tell Richard Thompson, you know, that if it hadn't been for Legion Leaf, we'd still be a heavy metal bar band in East LA. That record inspired us to look for our own roots and our own traditions and, you know, and stop trying to be something we weren't."
That's incredible. I think we need to move to the book. I so wanted to hear something about the Incredible String Band. If there's any short, they were so unique and magical. And
well, there's a little hope for some of us who mourn the fact that they've never had a second look, really, from the, you know, they were very big in the, like, 66 to 69.
And I had no idea they sold that many records.
Yeah, we filled the Fillmore, East, West, Lincoln Center, you know, in that sort of 2 or 3 year period. But Woodstock, the combination of Woodstock and Scientology kind of, you know, deflated their balloon rather severely. And in all the kind of re-examination of the 60s, they've never been renewed, you know, looked at again. And, but now, Rough Trade Records in London, Martin Mills, who owns Beggar's Banquet and who owns Rough Trade, and Jeff Travis from Rough Trade, both say that they grew up listening to the Incredible String Band, and they have spent 2 years negotiating with the Warner Brothers Business Affairs Department, which I believe is in this neighborhood, which is a heart-destroying, soul-destroying thing to do, to negotiate with the Warner Brothers Business Affairs Department. But they finally got a deal to put out a box set of the Incredible String Band.
That's great.
And do a kind of proper reassessment of that music.
Which is so needed. It was so magical and drew on so many roots. And we'll talk about that another time. We need to get to the book.
Get to the book.
It's just incredible. And I want to just play a little montage here we have. The book follows the journeys of songs and music around the globe. And just to set it up, I'll play this one, and we may shorten some of the other ones.
We move
Pete Seeger, the Weavers. The big radio hit, The Tokens. And that song tells so many stories in your book, from even about where the falsetto comes from.
Right. I mean, it's in a way that encapsulates a lot of the power of influence, the power of records to cross borders, the power of music to cross borders, but also the brutal unfairness of the system of colonialism, of of music publishing, because that original, the first part you heard, was recorded in 1938, and it was released the day that Hitler invaded Poland, and it was called Mbube, which means lion, and that descant was improvised. You know, it was just a melody line that was improvised by Solomon Linda, who was packing records in the Gallo Records warehouse. And they were started in Johannesburg, South Africa. And he was a Zulu from deep in the Natal bush. And that tradition of harmony singing and songs about boys protecting the herd from the lion and all of that was just a traditional thing. And the Zulus were quite a distinct nation within all the groups in South Africa. They kept their culture very strong, they kept together. The families did not move to Johannesburg, they stayed back in Natal. And the men went and worked on mostly short-term contracts. And what they would do every weekend, they would get together and have singing contests. And Solomon Linda and his group, the Evening Birds, were champs of this circuit. And that record became the biggest record, such a big record in South Africa that the whole form of singing got to be called Mbube. And in 1948, Gallo made a deal with Decca, American Decca, to distribute their records in South Africa. And they thought, well, maybe if we're distributing their records, maybe they might distribute some of ours. So they sent a box of all their best-selling records to New York, to the Decca office. And nobody paid any attention, put the box in a corner. And then Alan Lomax came in and used a desk there because he was doing a project for Decca of field recordings. And he saw the box, and he saw some interesting-looking records, and he took them home to the apartment on the Upper West Side that he shared with Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger started playing the records, and he played Mbube, and he went, oh, that's a cool song. And he misunderstood the chorus, which is actually Oyimbube, Oyimbube. He heard it as Wimaway, Wimaway. And so he taught it to the Weavers. And then in 1951, the Weavers had a #1 hit with Goodnight Irene. And then Wimaway was their follow-up, and it was soaring up the charts, and it got to #6 in the East Coast, I think. And the House Un-American Activities Committee thought, wait a minute, we don't like the idea of these communists becoming stars. And they launched an investigation into the Weavers' politics and let all the radio stations around the country know that they shouldn't be playing this record. So they stopped. But then it got revived, people covered it, never went away, and that group Tokens went into the studio in 1960 to record their first single for RCA, and they said, we want to record Wimaway. And RCA A&R man said, there's no English lyrics. You know, come on, man, be real. You know, you can't have a hit without English lyrics. So they sent it over to this songwriter, RCA did, And he wrote these lyrics about, in the jungle, the mighty jungle. There are no jungles, by the way, in South Africa. And the token said, "You can't be serious. You don't want us to sing these lyrics, do you?" And RCA said, "Yes, we do. Yeah, and that you are going to sing them." And so they did. And it was a B-side, and a DJ in Boston turned it over. And
it was a B-side.
It was a B-side. And started playing the B-side, and it became a hit. And this whole story, most of the story, was recounted in a Rolling Stone article in 1990 by a guy called Rian Mallon, who's a wonderful South African writer. And so, in this book, I draw on such fantastic sources from so many great writers who delve deeper than I ever could.
But you put it all together and stir it up and show the connections between all this music. I mean, years later, Paul Simon, who you knew in the UK when he was...
Yeah. Paul Simon, I met Paul Simon when he was working the folk club circuit in London in 1967, 66. 66. And he actually told me the first night I met him at this folk club, I said, because I knew he said he'd had a record out in America, but he really liked England, he liked the circuit and everything and the folk clubs. And he said, "I don't know what to do. I'm sort of torn because, this producer, Tom Wilson, he wants me to come back and promote this single. They've overdubbed drums on this song of mine called Sound of Silence. And they've overdubbed drums. I hate it. It sounds awful. But they want me to come and promote it as a single. And I'm not sure, but maybe I'm going to have to go back because Artie, my pal Artie, wants me to come back.
And he had nothing going on.
Yeah, he had nothing going on. So that, of course, as we know, the rest is history. But the point, the reason that I start with Paul in this book, and is part, and obviously the title phrase is a first line from one of his songs on Graceland. And to me, music always lives in the rhythm. And Paul is somebody who fervently believes that. And I had a great conversation with him about this. He said he could talk for a short time, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. And he told me about his trip to Jamaica in the early 70s. He had this song called Why Don't You Write Me that he'd recorded with Simon and Garfunkel that he felt could be better. And he had this idea it might sound good as a reggae. And so he booked the top session guys and the studio in Kingston, flew down to Kingston, went into the studio, taught them the song, went through the song, and went, no, it doesn't work. But he understood that he was in the presence of masters, that these guys were unbelievable musicians, and that it would be completely insane for him to go back to New York without something. And so they just sat there and jammed on some chord changes and some feels, tried different kinds of rock steady and reggae feels. And then he went back to New York with this tape, and knowing that he had something great, but he took him 2 months before he said he kept listening to it over and over, just these tracks, and eventually came up with the lyrics for Mother and Child Reunion and put it over that track, and top 5 record. And so when he went to Johannesburg, like 15 years later, it was exactly the same process. He went with no lyrics. He hadn't written a word. But he was fascinated by the rhythm and by these master musicians. And he originally went to Jamaica to cut one track. And once he got there, he thought, wait a minute, these guys are incredible. Maybe it could be more. And the music was so rich that Umbaklanga style, which is a Zulu wedding dance, basically, beat, that was transformed into a commercial form in South Africa and kind of ruled South Africa for some years, but was over by the time he went there. And the musicians he met, they kept saying, wait a minute, why do you want this old-fashioned stuff? We can play funk, you know? and he said, no, I want the old-fashioned stuff. And he recorded the whole album of rhythm tracks without a single word. And then he took it back to New York and listened for months. And he said they were so good, the tracks, that they intimidated him. And he was scared to start writing lyrics because he wanted them to be good enough. And so when he finally did, you know, they had to be that good.
In just one of the incredible stories, the hundreds and hundreds of stories in your new book, And the Roots of Rhythm Remain. And I want to, if you don't mind, talk about the gentleman, I don't remember his name, Pacific Jazz Records, not falling asleep, he was more zoned in.
Or out.
Yeah, and all the connections that came out of that.
Well, I start there's a chapter that I start with Ravi Shankar's first ever concert in America. He came 1955, I think, or 56, to New York, to Town Hall. And it was about a third full. And this West Coast record producer named Dick Bach, who ran Pacific Jazz Records, had come to talk to George Avakian, who was the head of jazz for Columbia Records at the time. And Avakian said, hey, Yehudi Menuhin tells me this guy's fantastic. We better go along and see him. So he went along to this town hall concert. And during the first half, during one of the ragas, he just kind of, you know, nodded off. And Avakian asked him afterwards, were you bored? And Bach said, no, I was not bored at all. It's just that the music took me to this place of complete sort of transcendent peace. And as I say in the book, he didn't have the language of the late 60s, but if he had, he would have said, I tripped out on the music. And he became the key figure for Ravi Shankar in America. He became his kind of manager, and he had a studio in LA, Pacific Jazz, that Ravi used as a base. You know, he used to come and hang out there and give master classes there, and then record. And World Pacific, he started the World Pacific label just to release these Ravi Shankar records. And then shall I go on to the...
Please.
So the way this story comes in spirals and circles is that Pacific Jazz was struggling, like most good independent labels, as I know so well. You know, it's a struggle, and not all of us succeed. And you know, and anyway, Dick Bach was rescued by some How to Play the 12-String Guitar records, by a producer called Jim Dixon. And so Bach was so grateful to Jim Dixon that he gave him keys to the studio. He said, anytime you want to use the studio to make demos or anything like that, just help yourself. Rehearsal space, anything you like. And Jim Dixon was scouring the folk clubs of LA in the early 60s looking for talent. And he came up with a guy called Jim McGuinn, later known as Roger, and Gene Clark. And so they started rehearsing there, and then he found David Crosby, and he brought him into the mix. And the three of them came up with this very unique vocal sound, where Clark and McGuinn would sing the melody in unison, and Crosby would sing some weird fourth, fifth, sixth above the melody as a harmony. And that was their sound. They called themselves the Beefeaters. And they would, and anyway, one night they were sitting in there, and Dixon came in, and there were joints being passed around. And Dixon had a test pressing of the new Ravi Shankar record, which Dick Bach had just produced, and Dixon had been in on the session. And he was curious to see what these kids made of Ravi Shankar. And so he put the record on, and they went, McGuinn and Crosby particularly went completely bananas. And Crosby grabbed the record, took it home, spent like the next week playing it every day, said it was such an incredible trip. And later that was the summer of '65. That was the spring of '65. And then during that period, Dixon, who had been at the '64 Newport Folk Festival and heard Bob Dylan sing for the first time, Mr. Tambourine Man, and persuaded Albert Grossman to give him a demo of the song, taught it to the group. And they were all ready to release and record this record, but David Crosby said, I don't think we should do it. I don't want to do it. And so Dixon brought Dylan down to the rehearsal to this same studio space and made them play the song for Dylan. And Dylan said, wow, man, you can dance to that, and endorsed the idea of the single. So that summer, as we've mentioned, that I was the production manager at Newport that summer, the Byrds were on the radio all the time, Mr. Tambourine Man. And the Beatles, 2 weeks after Newport '65, there was another equally important moment where the Beatles played Shea Stadium, and they couldn't hear themselves because of all the screaming girls. And they decided, we don't want to do this anymore. This is over. We don't want to play stadiums. We don't want to do live tours. We want to just record. And they then had a break on this tour, and they went to LA, and they rented Zsa Zsa Gabor's house, and they had parties every night for a week. And one night, tripping out, stoned, whatever, Lennon and Harrison were sitting in Zsa Zsa's gigantic bathtub, and Jim McGuinn and David Crosby were standing had one foot up with their guitars on the edge of the bathtub, explaining Indian music to John Lennon and George Harrison, and said, listen, this shit is great. You wait till you get your head around this stuff. And they were explaining about the modal scales and the whole thing. And George went back to London at the end of the tour, bought a sitar, and when they went in to start doing Rubber Soul, do we have that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
we play this little montage?
Yeah, John Lennon said to George, hey, why don't you try shadowing the melody on that Indian thingy of yours?
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. What you paid for your riches and fame? Was it all a strange game? You're a little insane. The money that came and the public acclaim. Don't forget what you are. You're a rock and roll star. La 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 la.
And those notes that he's playing influenced.
Today we passed on the street. You just walked on by. My heart just fell.
Great Dan Penn song, Box Tops.
And I began to cry.
That's not Ravi Shankar, is it?
No.
The guitar sitar was a very cheesy instrument. I had one. It just had a little bent.
But I mean, the thing spread, and the track in the middle, we didn't actually hear the crazy solo. But those of you who know that track, there's an insane solo in the middle by McGuinn.
Oh, McGuinn, yeah.
And that solo comes about because one of the things that the Byrds had, they went to England on a tour, and they got given a cassette player which nobody had ever heard of in America. They didn't exist. They weren't for sale. The cassettes had never been seen or heard. And they had a cassette player, and they had a couple of blank cassettes. And they had, on a tour across America from California to the East Coast, they had a camper van, and they all lived in there, and they did nothing but play. They plugged a cassette player into a guitar amp. And the one cassette they had John Coltrane's India on one side and a Ravi Shankar Raga on the other. And they listened to that for the whole trip across the country. Got to New York, went into a studio and recorded You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star, and that solo, if you listen to it, it's like John Coltrane meets Ravi Shankar.
And somehow another connection, Hugh Masekela playing
Which
on
I
that
didn't know.
track,
I
too.
just learned that now. You know.
It's crazy. And what I love about sitar, and in your book, how you just connect the world and the sitar with finding the notes between the notes. And a young man in Hawaii finding a way to play the guitar.
Yeah, with in the 1880s, a guy called Joseph Kikuku was the first person to turn the guitar on its side, put it in an open tuning, find a piece of metal and slide it up and down to change the keys. And then a Hawaiian troupe toured America before World War I, around 1908 or something, and they did a lot of dates around the South, and people in Mississippi particularly were intrigued by this. And one of the reasons they were intrigued was because with this tuning and with this use of a metal bar to slide the notes, as you say, you could find the notes between the notes. Because what John Coltrane discovered when he was making that record, India, and before, and what so many other musicians had discovered, is that the Western system of piano keys, tempered scales, guitar frets, saxophone valves, is completely arbitrary and has no relation to how the rest of the world hears music. They don't hear music in these steps, you know, A, B, C, sharp, you know, flats and sharps and whole notes. They're always flexible to notes between those notes. And in the memory, in the distant DNA memory, musical DNA of people who were brought in chains to America from Africa, and if people come from Asia or wherever, they're always missing something in these tempered scale. And the flatted fifth, the blue notes, the flat seventh, that's all a symptom of this search between these arbitrary divisions.
And the rhythms between the rhythms you
Yeah.
talk about so much, too,
yeah.
how that got here, too. There's so much we can't talk about here that's in the amazing new book you've got. And just out of selfishness, I have to have you talk about Django.
Absolutely. Well, this, I think everybody knows, I mean, most of you will know about Django Reinhardt, a little bit about Django Reinhardt, who was, you know, one difference I find in audiences in America and Europe is that the presence of Roma is something that's very constant. Everybody knows about Roma communities, and across centuries in Europe, you used to have these caravans of, you know, Roma people pulling into a town and telling fortunes and playing music, and, you know, and they were, you know, reviled by the church and by many authorities. It's a very complicated story, but it originates in India. They began in India, and they left India in the 5th century AD and went through Persia, through Armenia, through Turkey, up into the Balkans. And many millions were enslaved in Romania. And they were, by law, gypsies as they were called, were considered slaves up until about 1850, when they, along with the freeing of the serfs in Russia and the freeing of slaves in America, that rule was abolished. And they fled, and there was a wave of Roma migration into Western Europe. And one of those families had a son they called Jean Reinhardt. That was his official name, but when they got back to the encampment outside town, they always used his Roma name, which was Django, which means I awake in Romany. And his story is incredible. He got his hand terribly burned in a fire, lost the use of the fourth and fifth fingers. All the great Django solos that you may have heard are played with the thumb fretting the bottom string and the second and third finger doing all those incredible runs just with these three fingers. And, you know, his story is too long to go into, but there's a coda to the story, which I think would resonate here in Tennessee. Django died of a cerebral hemorrhage one morning in 1953, just as he was finishing his coffee, fishing rod in hand. He was 43. He had lived the ultimate Roma life, running musical rings around the Gage, that means non-Roma, us, while embracing every cliche, ignoring contracts, taking months learning to scrawl his signature, spending his substantial earnings the instant they crossed his palm, buying one new automobile after another, then wrecking them while driving without a license. During his tour with Duke Ellington, his one visit to America was in 1947 with the Ellington Orchestra, but they never recorded because the Union had a ban on recording at that time. During the Ellington tour, he once interrupted a rehearsal, claiming to hear an error in one of the horn parts that no one else noticed. To everyone's astonishment, the Duke's charts were wrong, and Django was right. In Reinhardt's charred hands, the oppressed cultures of African Americans and Roma were joined. He was proud of his heritage, but aspired to blackness, worshiping first Armstrong and Ellington, then Parker and Gillespie as gods. He would have been gratified had he known that west to east wasn't the only direction influence flowed across the North Atlantic. A young American guitarist stumbled on some Hot Club 78s in 1947 as he was starting to explore the instrument's possibilities. Quote, Django's ideas lit up my brain. He was light and free and fast as the fastest trumpet, running through chord changes with the skill of a sprinter and the imagination of a poet. I loved Django because of the joy in his music, the light-hearted feeling and freedom to do whatever he felt, which nicely sums up how B.B. King, the author of that quote, transformed blues guitar.
This is a necessary book. This book is incredible. Dana, do we have time for a couple of questions? I know we're running over as it is. We do? Okay. Why don't we take 3, so make them good questions. and we've got a microphone to speak in because it's going to be on a radio show. So should they come up here? Or?
I can hand it out, or they can...
You can hand, you want to hand it around? You can choose the people, too.
Thank you. Such an honor to meet you, Mr. Boyd, one of the greatest producers of all time. How did you meet Nick Drake?
We didn't even get to.
Yeah. I met Nick Drake because of Fairport Convention, because they played an anti-Vietnam marathon concert at the Roundhouse, and there were lots of mixture of well-known and unknown artists who played for 24 hours, and audience came and went, and the bass player, Ashley Hutchings, the rest of the group, they played, they went home, Ashley stayed, and he heard Nick, and he went over to him when he came off stage and said, "Give me your phone number." And Ashley came into my office the next day and handed me this piece of paper with a phone number on it. And he said, "I think you should call this guy." And that's how I met Nick Drake.
Thanks for asking that. Another question? No, because I'm going to use it on the radio.
Yeah, we gotta have a mic. We gotta have a mic.
I was going to ask that question about Nick Drake. I'm glad we at least touched on it. But I'd like to get your impressions of the late, great Sandy Denny, one of the most incredible singers of all time, and sadly lost too soon.
Well, Sandy, again, you know, I was so fortunate, you know, I finding Nick, and at the time I already had started working with Sandy, and it was a bit, I don't know, I feel a bit strange about the way that all went down, because I met her, and my first impression when I first heard her was that she sang too loud. You know, in the folk clubs, she really belted the songs out, but you kind of had to, because there was no mics. And but then when I got to really appreciate how great she was, I felt Fairport needed a stronger vocalist to balance Richard, but I felt that I just hesitated to suggest Sandy as the vocalist for Fairport because of the personalities. These were, at the time, very mild-mannered, polite little boys from Muswell Hill. And Sandy, as you know, she was a nice middle-class girl, but she, effing and blinding, as we used to say in England, she had a mouth like a sailor and would bite off the head of anybody who asked an impertinent question, or did not suffer fools at all gladly. And I thought she would have them for breakfast. And I was on a tour with the Incredible String Band, and I got a message from my office that they had invited her to audition as their new vocalist. And she always said to me that she thought she was auditioning them. And she went to this, but when I got back, by the time I got back, they'd been together for a week or so, and I went to a rehearsal, and it was just incredible. She was so well behaved because she was so in awe of Richard. You know, she had never heard anyone play guitar behind her like that. And so instead of like pushing everybody around, she was like, "Okay, I'm part of the group. I'm here. What do you want me to do? Just tell me what to sing and I'll do it." She just loved that musical collaboration with Richard.
And she inspired him to write.
Exactly. She everything, you know, he pushed her, she pushed him. They both together, you know, achieved great things. And it's a shame that, you know, there were so many different issues that she had to confront to continue with Fairport. She hated flying. She really was scared of flying. She didn't want to fly. And they were gagging to come to America. You know, they really wanted to, and they loved touring. And she didn't. And so that led to this sort of eventual breakup and them turning into an all-guy band. But it was incredible. My first reading for this book was about a month and 6 weeks ago at the Crop Ready Festival, which is every year 20,000 people come to Oxfordshire to a Fairport Convention Festival, and different members, and it's such a shame that Sandy's not one of them, you know, that she passed many, many years ago. But still, there's this bond. Whoever has ever been a member of Fairport is welcome to come back on a regular basis. And they also have great lineups of other artists every year. And I had a great audience. The biggest audience I've ever read my book to. You know. One more?
If we have one more, or I might ask you quickly, what was the air like in the room for Shoot Out the Lights, Richard and Linda Thompson.
That was a really fun record to make. Again, I was lucky. It's sort of a cheat because Richard and Linda's manager, didn't really like me very much, and they'd been cut loose by Chrysalis Records, and I wanted to sign them to Hannibal, and he said, "We're not signing with a little indie like you, and we're going to make it. We got to deal with Hugh Murphy and what's his name? Stuck in the middle with you, Baker Street, Jerry Rafferty and Hugh Murphy." And I said to Richard, I said, I don't think you're going to like that. I think their way of making records is not your way of making records. They were very pop, layering things up, doing things step by step. And Richard likes playing live. And he said, "Well, I think it'll be a challenging experience, interesting experience. I want to have this experience." "Okay, Richard." And then, of course, it turned into a train wreck and didn't work, and he hated the process and hated what was coming out of and hadn't signed the contract. And so at a certain point, he and Dave Pegg and Dave Matix and Simon Nickel and Linda just walked across the street to Hannibal Records, and we went in the studio, and they already knew the songs. And so we just went in the studio and cut all the tracks in 3 days. And in Sound Techniques, which is where we'd cut Legion Leaf and all those other ones, and so they felt right at home. And it was, and it was an incredible experience. But I sensed, it was a combination of feeling. I mean, Linda was pregnant, but those songs, they were all about the end of a relationship,
right.
And I was thinking to myself, what's going on here? And then sure enough, before the record came out, they broke up. And again, Joe Lustig, the manager, my adversary, may he rest in peace. I called up and I said, we had this great American tour booked. And I called him up, and he called me up, and he said, "Well, Linda can't possibly go on the tour in these circumstances." And I said, "Really?" And I called Linda, and she said, "I've lost a husband. I'm damned if I'm going to lose an American tour as well." And she said, you got to pay for me to have a girlfriend come with me, so I'm not just the girl with the guys. And if you do that, I'll do the tour. And she sang like an angel throughout this whole tour. All these songs that are like about the end of a relationship.
I guess, are we one more question? Okay, I saw one back.
Somebody in the back there, I think.
We need 3 times this amount of time, and we still wouldn't cover it.
Thank you, Joe. I wanted to ask you again, and I'm sorry to bring Nick Drake again, but it's such a mysterious character in general. I wanted to get your insight on what it was like to be in the studio with him, seeing him record those songs and being present or being a part of that creative process. And if there's anything in particular or a particular anecdote that you could share.
Well, the most significant thing I can share about Nick in the studio is that he was perfect. I mean, I know it sounds simple to say, but it got to the point when, particularly on Brighter Later, when we had like drum and bass and other instruments playing with him, John Wood and I, when we were doing a take, we would turn Nick's monitor off. We wouldn't hear the guitar and the voice because it was, for a combination of reasons, we knew that Nick's track would be perfect. We had experience enough to know that he never made a mistake. He always sang on pitch. And also there was another aspect, which was that it was so seductive in a way to listen to him sing and play the guitar, that we risked being distracted from focusing on whether the bass player was locked in with a foot. You know, that if you turn Nick off, you could really hear what everybody else was doing very clearly and say, well, okay, let's go back to the top again, let's start again. And we could really hear, because, you know, the last thing you wanted to do with a Nick Drake track was to get into the mix and discover you don't really like the way the rhythm guitar or some other instrument, you know, was playing, or that they'd missed a chord somewhere. And so you wanted to really be able to focus on that. And then, of course, once we got a great take from everybody else, we'd say, come on into the control room. We'd come in, everybody sit down, we'd flick Nick's tracks back on, and then we'd listen to it, and of course it would be sublime. And that's, I think, the most telling anecdote I can tell about Nick in the studio. I don't know, maybe this is too indulgent, but as a kind of, if we're going to finish here, maybe as an exit music, you could play that Riverman. One of the things that always intrigued me about Nick, years later, I talked to Nick about his taste in music, what he had in his collection, what he liked. He loved Django, he loved Miles Davis, he loved Dylan, you know, he loved Bert Chance, you know. But years later, after he died, I started getting more into listening to music from other cultures, and one of the most intriguing artists was João Gilberto and Bossa Nova. And as characters, they're so similar in a way. You know, João, before he was famous, he used to play in bars, and if people talked too loud, you know, because he sang so quiet and he didn't really talk, just like Nick. And if people started chattering in the place, he used to get up and walk off stage. And he, you know, didn't wash his hair all the time, and he was kind of like a weird outlier. And then the way the guitar in João Gilberto is a voice, independent almost of the vocal, and they work in some sort of weird, not weird, but wonderful counterpoint to each other. I kept thinking, I wonder if Nick heard much João Gilberto. And I met some friend of his not too long ago who told me, yeah, Nick had a copy of one of João's records in his collection. So I never got the smoking gun of, yes, I love João Gilberto, but to me, it's there. And as we go, let's call a halt. This is it. Thank you so much, buddy.
Thank you.
But we'll
Joe Boyd, this